Please state your name
Tia.
and what mix are you?
I'm Indian, Cuban, and Trinidadian.
So who is Indian, Cuban, and Trinidadian and stuff?
Okay. So both of my parents are half Indian. My mom is half Indian and half Cuban, and my dad is half Indian and half Trinidadian.
And what was that like growing up for you?
So I grew up in Hong Kong, which was really interesting because I mean, I was surrounded by so many different cultures, and growing up in a cosmopolitan city, much like London, I think I was exposed to, you know, again, so many different cultures, so many different religions. And in that way, I was really fortunate. But I think as well, it kind of made it really difficult to connect with my own culture and my own identity growing up. I feel as well, like as a third culture kid, which is a term often used for, children that grow up in different parts of the world that is not like um centrally associated with, like their motherland, for example. Like I didn't grow up in India, despite my parents both growing up there until they were 18 or 20, and then they also left. I think it makes it harder to connect with your own kind of culture and your own background and your own religion. And often when you're growing up in a foreign country as well, you try and kind of seek out community from, other people, and like other people that are from like the same kind of cultures and communities as you, but I feel like they're also in that really weird place where they don't know themselves. And I think again it kind of comes from obviously our upbringing as well, and how that influences us. But I think as well, like because my parents, they left home so early on, I think that they even found it hard to kind of instill that cultural background into my upbringing as well. I mean, I would say that I'm very, very like closely linked with my Indian heritage. And, I'm very kind of what's the word? Strongly like, associated to like, yeah, like my culture, my religion. Like I grew up Hindu, and all of my kind of relatives are all over the world, but mainly they grew up in India as well. And both of my parents' parents, my grandparents, they had immigrated from Trinidad and from Cuba to India generations ago. So I feel very heavily kind of influenced, but also closely affiliated with my Indian roots, as opposed to my Cuban and my Trini roots. So that was nice, but again, it also felt quite disassociated from that as well in a way.
So you saying that you're more in tune with your Indian roots. Do you get any like assumptions about your race? And like when you say that you're part Indian, half Indian, and like people don't believe you, like how do you take that if that does happen?
Yeah, it's funny that you say that because growing up in Hong Kong, there's a really, really large Indian community. It's one of the biggest communities that we have. Um, and I went to a school that kind of, it celebrated so many different cultures and so many different religions. And we would often have like Diwali Ball, which, as you know, is a really, really big festival. It's celebrated all over India, all over the world. Um, but I always kind of felt disconnected from other Indian people because I felt like I wasn't, necessarily like Indian enough or brown enough to be associated with other Indians.
Mhm.
Um, but then I also wasn't like Latina enough to be associated with other Latina people. And same with my Trini roots as well. So it just kind of left me in this really, really weird like limbo stage of like trying to grasp at straws essentially. And I think a lot of Indians as well, like when I tell them that I am Indian, they're always really surprised. They kind of think like, oh, because I don't sound a certain way, or because I don't dress a certain way, or because I'm not, loudly advertising the fact that I'm brown or that I'm Indian, then it's almost like I'm not proud of my heritage.
Mhm.
And like I'm kind of, being um what's it called? I'm overly privileged and I'm looking at other Indians as if like I'm better than them, which I often like had a few issues in university come up because, you know, even though I had no direct influence in where my parents had left India and like they ended up moving to Hong Kong, they ended up moving all over the world. As you know, a child of immigrants, I think it's really, really difficult to try and, you know, find your footing in a world where people want to just typecast you in a certain role and in a certain, you know, like heritage group as well. So I think trying to connect with like other Indians made it really, really difficult to connect to my own heritage in a way, because it felt like I couldn't belong because I didn't look a certain way, or I didn't act a certain way, or I didn't, you know, blast my religion out loud for everyone, even though like I am a very religious person and I grew up Hindu. Um, yeah, I feel like faith as well, that's such a large thing when it comes to talking about, you know, your identity and growing up in those communities as well.
Do you think if you were like located somewhere like Britain more earlier in your life,
Mhm.
you would feel more connected to your Trinidadian and like Cuban roots?
Oh yeah, for sure. I think especially with my Trini roots and how much, you know, African and Caribbean culture is just celebrated over here as well. Like especially through, you know, festivals like Carney. And we never really had that kind of representation in Hong Kong.
Mhm.
Um, you know, so I think when I came to London as a 17-year-old, I was so culturally shocked, but also at the same time, I felt so like I could, you know, assimilate myself more into my Trini and my Cuban roots as well, and have that be more part of my identity in a way where it didn't need to be so distantly viewed, and it didn't need to
Mhm.
be so kind of like unattainable in a way, you know.
Has someone ever told you that you're not black?
Yeah, many times.
Yeah, and how does
I
that make you
think
feel?
it's really like frustrating in a way. But at the same time, I feel like everyone is entitled to their own opinion. And we live in a world where no one can kind of place anyone where they're from. Like
Mhm.
we're all chameleons, and like we're so culturally diverse that, you know, if you don't look a certain way, people are always going to question that about you anyway. Um, I've had people tell me that, you know, you're not black. And I don't know what to respond to that with. I mean, am I supposed to act a certain way? Am I supposed to, you know, um, kind of play into those stereotypes that are like extremely offensive? No, the only thing I can say is that's your opinion and that's all fine and good, but my opinion is what matters and I know where I come from. So, yeah.
With the stereotypes that surround um black people, Cuban people, Indian people, and whatever,
Yeah.
has that like given you a sense of imposter syndrome because you can't, well, not that they're true, but like you don't really fit any of those boxes?
Oh yeah, for sure. I think as well, language is such a big part of that as well.
Mhm.
And the fact that, you know, I'm not entirely confident in speaking like Hindi or in speaking Spanish, for example, I think that that also kind of makes it a bit more difficult in terms of like trying to again connect to those parts of myself that seem again super unattainable. Um, and yeah, I think so many of those stereotypes are, you know, they play into so many things that are just, I mean, one, offensive, but two, I think that, you know, they expect the world to be again typecast into a certain role and to act a certain way. Like, I remember once I told someone that I was Indian and they literally looked at me and they were like, "Oh, are you? But you don't seem Indian."
Mhm.
And because I have tattoos in Sanskrit, people are always like, "Oh, do you know what that means?" And it's like, yeah,
Yeah.
I do know what that means, you know. And I think the same goes for my upbringing in Hong Kong as well. It's like when I speak to other Asians about the fact that I grew up in Hong Kong, it's almost like a game for them to test like if I'm actually from Hong Kong.
Yeah, if you're
Or
like, yeah, enough.
yeah,
Yeah.
yeah, exactly. It's like, oh, like, can you speak the language? Or can you, say something in Cantonese, or um it's almost like testing someone to see like if they're actually from that place. And I feel like that again is just such a microaggression in itself. It's like, why do you need to play a game of, you know, like, yeah, why do you need to play a game, period? Trying to see if that person is actually, being truthful to their own identity. And that in itself makes me question, like, oh, am I being truthful to myself and to my own identity? If other people are questioning it, who actually am I? And I think it bears the question of like the imposter syndrome again.
Yeah, and like the otherness, what do you feel like with having like two mixed race parents? Did they ever instill like did you ever feel with them that they had this label of otherness attached to them that was brought down with you, if that makes sense? Because they're
Yeah,
mixed.
yeah, I'll take an example from for my dad, for example. I mean, he had moved from India to Spain, and then from Spain he ended up moving to Japan, and he was there for about 10 years before he moved to Hong Kong. And in Japan, he used to tell me a lot of the stories about, the kind of like micro and macro aggressions that he had faced, and no one really talks about the internalized racism, not only within the own, like within our own Indian community, if you're thinking about like the caste system
Yeah,
as
of course,
well,
yeah.
which is what my mom had faced when my parents were getting arranged married.
Mm.
Um, because obviously she's mixed race and she doesn't look entirely Indian, based off of her skin tone. Um, but my dad was basically telling me these stories about all the micro and macro aggressions that he had faced, and the struggle that he faced himself with trying to kind of connect to his own roots and almost like shunning his own roots because he felt the need to assimilate himself in a completely different environment, in a completely different culture, and how difficult that was for him as well. And I think a lot of the times that trickles down into like generational trauma as well for us, is that
Yeah.
we feel almost ashamed of our heritage. But I think coming to London, it made me appreciate so much more, the fact that so many different heritages and like cultures and religions are all celebrated over here. And that's definitely helped a lot as well. And just like community as well, which I didn't really have growing up.
Of course, yeah. Especially when excuse me, especially when you're a mixed race person who's not got any like association with whiteness. And I do feel
Yeah.
like representation is a very big thing in like mixed race in our
Hmm.
like finding out who we are as a mixed race person. Do you
Yeah, for
feel
sure.
like because like for me, for example, I had no like there's no black and Indian person that I could really look at in like TV shows or books or
Yeah.
anything. And I was reading Natalie Morris's Mixed and Other. And even the fact that she brought up being black and Indian, it was only to say, oh, we need to talk about it more. There's not a lot of representation. Do you feel like that lack of representation has also kind of um not been able to help you find out who you are in like identity wise?
Yeah, I definitely think so. And I think, I'm very grateful that now we have more representation happening, especially for the younger generation, because I feel like they definitely could benefit from it, especially from where we had kind of lacked in that department. You have shows now like Never Have I Ever,
Mhm.
starring like a brown actress, a Tamil actress, and
Yeah, she's
then
dark
you
skinned as well.
have,
That makes the biggest difference.
yeah,
Yeah,
then you have like One Day, for example, Ambika,
yeah,
and then you've got Mindy Kaling. You have got loads of brown representation now, but I really do wish that growing up we did have more of that, because I felt like even beauty standards are so fetishized and glamorized now in being brown and in being black and in being Asian as well. And it's glorified by white people most of the
absolutely.
time. It's our white counterparts, but they're also the ones that had initially set those beauty standards up to not benefit us in any way. I remember being, in school and being bullied for having a unibrow and for being too dark and being called derogatory terms as well by white people in my school. Um, being insulted for being too black and being insulted for being too brown.
Yeah, of course.
Um, and I remember like just hating those parts about myself, which now those features are all celebrated.
Yeah,
Having
of
darker
course.
skin and having brown skin is like amazing. And you see people going to sunbeds and tanning salons and they're glorifying, the fact that they want that skin, they want that color, they want that glow. Um, whereas before, like if you were dark, then you were considered dirty. Do you know what I
Yeah,
mean?
of
So
course.
these beauty standards and everything about the industry as a whole is constantly evolving and constantly changing. And I feel like brown representation and black representation are, you know, two areas in which I hope that we continue to see more representation, because there aren't many of us that are actually paving the way for women and for people of color to actually thrive and not be typecast
Yeah,
again
of course.
as in like shows and in TV, and in like movies and stuff. As great as it is to see someone that looks like you on the screen, I think that we need to remember as well that a lot of the times directors and producers will often just fill a diversity quota by having a brown person or a
Yes,
black
yeah.
person cast into a film or into a show, and they'll typecast them into a specific role, and it'll just be a consistent thing that you'll see happen over many other movies and many other films and like shows, sorry. So I think that as good as it is to have the representation now, I really do wish that, I did have that growing up, because maybe it would have changed how myself and a lot of other brown and mixed race kids could have seen ourselves growing
Yeah.
up.
I feel like with the representation as well, there is a lot of like, there's less of that almost imposter syndrome of like, who am I?
Mm,
Because of
mm,
we're finally getting acknowledged in like
mm.
more TV shows and films, even with interracial relationships as well. It's like, I think
Yeah,
it's very nice to see. And also
yeah.
speaking about like typecasting and stereotypes and stuff like that, there's also been a lot of like, there's a mixed race stereotype of just being like fetishized and just a bit like exotic and
Mm,
stuff like that. And obviously,
yeah,
in the most respectful way, you are kind of the epitome
yeah,
of that
yeah, of
stereotype.
course.
What is
Yeah.
that? What does being the epitome of that stereotype and then going on to potentially have children in the future? How are you gonna help them navigate that? Because they'll be even more mixed than you are.
That's so true. That's actually a really good question, and I hadn't thought about that before. But I think that just being like as transparent and just sharing your journey as well, and being as open as you can with your kids and the future generation as well, and again hoping that representation just continues to evolve and to grow, and sharing stories between like my grandparents and my parents and my with my kids, and you know kind of encouraging them to accept all like facets of themselves and all cultures and all parts of themselves. I think is super important. And I think they will face, obviously, every person faces challenges in their lives, but I think that you know as a child of like interracial marriage or like mixed race heritage, I think that they will face, often like a lot of questions about where they come from. And I think that instead of looking at it as like a imposter syndrome kind of situation, they should look at it in the sense of like, the silver linings or like the glass half full kind of situation where like, wow, I'm so fortunate to be from so many different parts of the world, to experience so many different cultures, and to, just like enjoy the fact that I can be I'm a chameleon again. Like I can be from one place, I can also be from another place. I can, embrace different, parts of myself and different parts of my heritage. So I think that's important, and that's something that, reassures me in the sense that if I do ever have kids, then that is something that I will instill into them from a very young age.
How has your mixed race identity um formed your friendships and like how has that friendships affected you with your mixed race identity?
Um, I think that again, growing up in Hong Kong, I had so many different friends from different parts of the world, which I was really, really fortunate to have. A few of them were just English. They were white. And I think I found it a bit difficult to try and connect with them
Hmm.
on a kind of deeper level in regards to, the differences that I face just as a person of color on a day-to-day basis, and the disparity between, being a person of color versus my white counterparts.
Hmm.
Um, and I think for them, it's something that they're also trying to kind of acclimatize themselves to, given everything that we've gone through in the world,
Hmm.
with BLM and with other kind of, um, topics regarding race and gender and all of the other things. But I think that, yeah, I found it a bit difficult to kind of solidify those types of friendships, because it felt like I constantly felt like I was outnumbered in so many different ways, not
Yeah.
even in just like you know, on a very like surface level, but I felt like, for example, I went on holiday with one of my friends who she's amazing and incredible. And I think she was part of an interracial relationship.
Hmm.
So I had gone to Italy with my friend who's very much like Cornish princess, blonde hair, blue eyes from the UK. I'm obviously not. And we went to Italy, and I had faced a lot of racism when I was there, which I hadn't experienced before at such a high, level volume.
Hmm.
And she was there to witness it like firsthand. And I think that was the first time that she kind of understood, the term pretty privilege or the term white privilege.
Hmm. Yeah.
Um, there were many, many instances where I was kind of questioning my own behavior. Was I rude? Was I like, did I do anything that would make them feel uncomfortable? But no, like, after analyzing my behavior and after asking my friend and after asking people around me that were starting to notice the fact that I was just being pitted against for looking the way that I look, um, I think my friend had kind of felt like a very, very deep sense of like empathy, but also at the same time, I think she understood finally that, she has more power, and often they always will do. Our white counterparts will always have more power,
Yeah.
societally and just in general. And that's something that you come to kind of realize, and you come to just accept as a person of color growing up in society,
Hmm.
um, especially if you're not growing up in a place where the majority is white,
Yeah.
and you're outnumbered, and society isn't formed in a way to help you succeed. It's unfortunately made to just kind of work against you, not with you. And she had seen it firsthand. And I think that we had like a very, very deep conversation about the fact that, I felt like it was really, really difficult for me to form certain friendships with certain white people, because it felt like I was constantly having to justify certain things that they just couldn't relate to on a personal level. A lot of like micro and macro aggressions I had faced, they had never even come into contact with
Yeah.
in
Or
their
thought about it. Yeah.
existence.
Completely understand.
And it becomes really frustrating having to constantly educate our white counterparts as well about certain things that I feel like are not our responsibility to educate them on. And even in saying that, I feel like as a person of color, even saying that it's not our responsibility to educate our white counterparts,
I
it
agree.
makes us feel guilty, because it's like, oh, like we should be doing better for our own people. But at the same time, it's like we're tired. And society is a hierarchy formed to work against us, not for us. And I think that, again, my friend had noticed this as well. And, even after being in an interracial relationship herself, she had noticed a lot as well of what her boyfriend had faced at the time. But yeah, even growing up in Hong Kong, there's such a large kind of there's such a huge disparity in terms of race. And I feel like in the West, the Westerners are at the top of the totem pole, but
Yeah.
in the southeast, like in Hong Kong, brown and black people are literally
Excuse me.
at the bottom of the totem pole. I remember once Deliveroo had an option in Hong Kong to not have any Indian or Pakistani drivers deliver their food.
Wow.
Um,
Wow.
because uh Asian people didn't want brown people handling their food and delivering their
Yeah.
food to them. Um,
I always thought that as well. That there's also been like it's not really like first I think it's like a black and white issue, but I generally think
mm,
it's like a monoracial issue.
yeah, for
And like
sure.
for
The
me.
internalized racism that I face in Hong Kong is really crazy. I mean, I had people literally clutching their bag when they would sit next to me on the train and act as if I was going to rob them. Um, they would often like look at me as if I was dirty as well.
Hmm.
But I think again that's just something that I got used to growing up. And if you're like a local and you didn't go to an international school and you weren't exposed or privileged enough to be exposed to different cultures and communities, much like I was lucky enough to have that exposure. Then you wouldn't really know how to act around people that weren't like you or didn't look like you. And I think that was the case for a lot of Hong Kong locals. You know, they're always curious, and I think that's why they especially glorify and fetishize black people. It's like when you see a black person going to mainland China, everyone wants to take a photo with them,
Yes,
everyone
yes, I've
wants
had
to
that
hang out
before.
with them. But
Yeah.
if you see a brown person in mainland China or a brown person in Hong Kong, it's like, oh, that person's dirty and they work the low paying jobs
Yeah.
because they're desperate immigrants.
Yeah.
So it's really like there's a hierarchy everywhere in the world that you go. So yeah, I think that it's really, I mean, it's really interesting, but it's also extremely archaic and disappointing that we live in a society that still operates that way.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
yeah.
Final question. Do you think the feeling of otherness and isolation will ever leave non-white mixed race people?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's something that we can hope for. I
Mhm.
mean, making a prediction like that is quite bold, but I'd say that, yeah, that's something that we can definitely hope for and we can strive for. You know, luckily, again, we live in a generation where there is much more representation than what we had growing up. And, you know, we have pages like Diet Parata, for instance, that are trying to kind of push for more brown representation in the creative industry. And we have so many other communities and, you know, agencies out there that want to push for people of color way, way, way more. So I think that is something that we can look forward to. And I think, again, just forming friendships with whoever you want to form with and just making sure that they are informed as well,
Mhm.
you know, on the privilege that they hold if they're not a person of color. And I think that if they are a person of color, then just coming together and trying to, you know, create a community of your own, because community starts within your own space
Yeah.
anyway. So yeah.
Yeah. Perfect. Great. Thank you so much.
No worries.
Thank
I'm glad.
you.